Welcome everybody to the Centre for European Seminar. Some of you were here a year ago. A year ago, a few days after the war began, we had a seminar with Richard Shirreff and Tim Garton, who's with us online today, and Yulia Osmolovska, who hopefully will be online with us soon if we can sort out a technical glitch. We decided to recreate the team, the same team today, but add on in addition Olesya, Khromeychuk, and Freedman. I'm delighted to have them joining us today for the seminar. We've got quite a lot of people online as well as in the room here in London. I hope some of the questions we can look at will be things like 1 year on, is the Western unity going to be preserved? Can we maintain the Western unity? Can Ukraine continue to have the kind of military success which it has had so far over the past year? Can Russia get its act together militarily? How, if at all, will a peace settlement come about? And what will be the long-term relationship between Russia and the Western countries? I'm sure we'll tackle those, but many other questions today. I'd like first to turn to Tim, who can give us a bit of a historian's perspective. And Tim has a new book coming out next week called Homelands, A Personal History of Europe, based on his reportage over the last 30 or 40 years, and with a bit of history and get time together. But Tim, how does it look to you?
Thank you, Charles. I'm very sorry not to be with you all in person, but we have COVID in the house, and I didn't want to celebrate the first anniversary of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by giving somebody COVID. Let me make 4 points. First of all, having just spent a week in Kyiv, talking amongst others to General Zaluzhny, to Mr. Budanov, the head of Ukrainian military intelligence, to Andrei Yermak, the right-hand man of President Zelensky, and Mr. Kuleba. I'm sure that Laurie and Richard are going to say more about this, but it clearly is a critical moment militarily. Zaluzhny made it quite plain that they really are running rather critically low on stocks of Soviet-type ammunition. As he put it to me, if we run out of the ammunition for our Soviet-type tanks, they're not tanks, they're tractors. So on the one hand, you have that rather critical situation. On the other hand, they're clearly preparing a major counteroffensive with a number of new Western equipped and trained brigades. And if they're successful, for example, in going south, getting to the Sea of Azov, splitting the Russian occupation, that's going to give them the strategic initiative back. That's point number one. Point number two, Crimea. Every single person I have spoken to, Ukrainian in or outside Ukraine, says they should get Crimea back. Political, moral, historical, legal arguments for that, but also strategic arguments. Number one, long term, we can't possibly be secure if we have Russian missile launches, as it were, for the British equivalent on the Isle of Wight. But also the strategic argument that Crimea is the only thing Putin and Russia really cares about, more than Donbass. And therefore, if you're actually going to put strategic pressure on Russia to come to the negotiating table, you need to put pressure on Donbass. Of course, most people in the West privately, entre nous, are saying something rather different about Crimea. So I think that's the point we need to focus on and get clarity about the position on Crimea. Point number three, like many people in the room, I've just come back from the Munich Security Conference. Are you having a problem with my sound quality?
Yeah, a little bit, yeah. Sure.
I don't think it's on my end. I think it's the muting of other participants. If everyone online can hear. So, like many other people, just come back from the Munich Security Conference. I heard 3 European prime ministers and the president-elect of the Czech Republic say in terms that they want Ukraine to be a member of NATO. Amazing what a difference a year of war makes. So the discussion has clearly moved on to membership both of EU and of NATO, which clearly is the only long-term guarantee of security for Ukraine. But in the meantime, it seems to me there's a real issue on the table about what kind of interim hard security guarantees the US and a number of other NATO member states might give them. General Petraeus in Munich talked about a US-led coalition of the willing, which may not be the most fortunate phrasing for some people, but the issue is absolutely there. What would hard security guarantees look like to bridge the gap between any cessation of hostilities and eventual EU and NATO membership? Final point, Charles, to your historical perspective, and thank you for mentioning my book, Homelands, available in all good Amazons, is this. Looking back over the last 50 years, it's absolutely clear now that the decline of the Russian Empire has been one of the great drivers of European history over the last 50 years. We kind of kidded ourselves it was over in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but it clearly wasn't. It came back in Transnistria and Chechnya, Georgia, Ukraine 2014, and then big time a year ago on the 24th of February. And this is, of course, the perspective which almost everybody in Ukraine shares. And I want to make just a couple of points about that. First of all, we do know from history that the processes of the decline of empires are traumatic and take a very long time. Let me remind you that we were dealing with the consequences of the end of the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires in former Yugoslavia at the end of the last century, in the 1990s. So we have to reckon that this is going to be a very long and traumatic process, even beyond the current conflict in Ukraine. And while, of course, we need to have a Russia policy, a direct Russia policy, there is going to be a limit to the extent that we can directly influence that evolution inside Russia itself. And so I would argue that for now, what we can influence is the external environment in which that process plays out. And so in a sense, our best Russia policy for now, until there's change in Moscow, is our Ukraine policy.
Switch the mute. When Tim is talking, we mute, and when I'm talking, we unmute. Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you, Tim. And I think people online are saying the sound's got better, which is good to hear. We don't have Yulia yet.
No.
Okay. Well, then, while we're waiting for Yulia, let's move on. And Richard, tell us how it looks from a. Remind me, you wrote a book called, what was it called? War 20.
It's called 2017 War with Russia.
Yes, a very good novel about how Russia invaded one of the Baltic states in 2017.
And went on the way to Ukraine.
Yeah. It was rather more pressing than one would have wished. But in your spare time, you would sat there while you were writing a novel.
No, I read the novel after I finished. That would not have that very well. Yes. As it was, it went down like a lead balloon. Mr. Hammond. Anyway, if I may, I'm going to start having a year on by paying tribute to the courage, the resilience, the extraordinary military cleverness, and the extraordinary sacrifice of Ukraine. I think, as Tim said this morning so brilliantly on the Today programme, in many ways, this last year has been Ukraine's 1940 moment, an example for us all. To military matters, operational level, in every campaign, there's a moment when the initiative changes. Arguably, that initiative could have changed significantly last year. There were a series of stunning Ukrainian successes, the battle for Kyiv, the offensive northeast of Kharkiv, and then, of course, the liberation of Kherson. If Ukraine had had the means after the liberation of Kherson, I suspect we could have seen pictures of mass numbers of Russian prisoners and potentially a significant, really significant strategic impact on Russia. But I suspect because of the dribbling rather than clouting of military aid into Ukraine, this sort of incremental approach, the Ukrainians probably were not in a position to be able to exploit that success. There could be another opportunity now. The Russian offensive in Lugansk province, according to Institute for the Study of War, which I check pretty well every day, is unlikely to be able to develop any form of significant momentum. And the Ukrainians are very likely, by all accounts, going to be able to hold it and subsequently develop a successful counteroffensive of their own. But the success or otherwise of that will depend, number one, on logistics, ammunition. Tim mentioned it. No Western country providing support to Ukraine, so far as I'm aware, has really majorly tooled up its industries to start providing ammunition on the scale that a counteroffensive in an era, once again, of state-on-state industrial warfare needs. So that's the first thing. And most NATO countries, of course, their assessment of daily ammunition expenditure rates has been dropped right down post-Cold War, and there's not been any serious thinking separately to remedy that. Less perhaps the Americans, and I haven't got visibility there. Second is the supply of weaponry and ammunition, weaponry and the capabilities required. We saw the arguments over tanks. It's not just tanks. Speaking as an ex-tank commander, they're important. But tanks on their own are frankly pretty bloody useless, as we saw with Russians and the way they completely screwed it up in the forests north of Kyiv. It's all about combined arms offensive capability, air, land, and taking the time to train, prepare, get the logistics in place, the sustainability in place, the planning, the rehearsals, to make sure that an offensive goes off properly. It takes time and effort. So there's a real question, I think, as to whether or not assume the Russian offensive peters off, assume the Russians culminate. Can Ukraine really launch the offensive at the optimum time to maximize success? I'd also mention another variable, which is China. I think that's going to be a major issue. And if China starts supporting Russia with weapons and ammunition and military aid, then I think that's a strategic game changer, potentially. Longer term, I think we've got to prepare our nations, our governments have got to start thinking this through, that assume Ukraine achieves its military objectives to liberate enough of Ukraine territory, including Crimea, to assure its security and sovereignty, assume that effort to get at the mind of Putin to force him into a negotiation happens. Longer term, de facto, there won't be peace in Europe with Putin in the Kremlin, and assume that he'll be replaced by somebody equally ultra-nationalist, and assume some form of state of Cold War with NATO continues. We've got to be prepared for a very long-term generational challenge of deterrence of an angry, revanchist Russia determined to come back and have another go. And I don't see any alternative to that. And finally, of course, Ukraine has absolutely got to be part of NATO, because remember the Budapest Memorandum and ad hoc arrangements like that. Nothing else is going to ultimately be enough. But to do that, NATO is going to have to be prepared to put troops in Ukraine, in the skies above Ukraine, and to really guarantee Ukrainian security. So that would be mine.
Thank you, Richard. That's great. Turn now to Olesya. Like everyone on the panel, you've written books recently, or writing. Your last book was called The Death of a Soldier Told by His Sister, and I know you've written many other books, and you're a very eminent historian. It's great to have you with us today.
Thank you. Only one other book.
Okay, yeah.
So, yeah, thank you so much for having me today and for discussing Ukraine. My observations will be a bit different, but will echo some of the things that have already been said. 2022 was a year of discovery for the Western world, and this is often the case for the Western world. It discovered something that's existed there for a very long time, and it discovered Ukraine finally. But I feel like that journey of discovery is incomplete still. The crash course in Ukrainian studies hasn't finished yet. And I'd like to, in the 5 minutes that I have, touch on 5 issues that I feel we need to explore in depth to begin to understand Ukraine appropriately. First of all, inaction. So towards maybe halfway through 2014, towards the end of 2014, I started to hear something that I continued to hear for the subsequent years and still do to some extent now, and that's that Crimea is a done deal. Yeah, so forget about, don't even question the fact that Russia at the time, it was referred to as annexed Crimea or occupied Crimea. It's a done deal. We need to move on. You need to appease Moscow. We need to continue. So the actions are inaction in the democratic world continuing business as usual, turning a blind eye to violation of international law, to violations of human rights in occupied territories, both in Crimea and in parts of occupied eastern Ukraine, had results. And it led to escalation. It facilitated escalation. And I haven't seen the soul searching among the political leadership so far about those first 8 years of the war, of Russia's war in Ukraine. And I think it's inevitable. We absolutely have to see it. We have to have that reckoning and taking responsibility for that inaction, because inaction is not a neutral thing. It's something that has really severe consequences, and which normalized Russia's violence in Ukraine, essentially normalized and facilitated escalation. The second point I want to make is defiance. We hear about Ukrainian defiance so much, and it's wonderful, to see that the admiration for Ukraine. But for me, it's also evidence that we've misunderstood Ukraine. Because Ukrainians did not wake up on the 24th of February 2022 feeling defiant. They already had 8 years of the war before that. They already had 30 years of basically fighting for democracy in their country and fighting against various authoritarian influences coming from Russia, but also from inside the political leadership. And they also had hundreds of years of colonial imperialist relationship with Moscow, which obviously led to this defiance. The world missed the point, I think, entirely, because why did we miss the point? Because we did not study Ukraine for what it was. And that's my third point, credibility. We've not perceived Ukrainian voices and voices of Ukraine experts as credible. We tend to listen to other imperial centers. Where did journalists go during the Orange Revolution and even during the Maidan protests of 2014? To Moscow to report on what is happening in Ukraine. It's only a year ago, roughly this time last year, when the Russian troops amassed around the borders of Ukraine, the journalists from all over the world flooded Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities. I think this idea of credibility, of whose voice we see as credible, is changing, but it hasn't changed entirely yet. We need to trust Ukrainians with their experiential knowledge of this war, but also of their relationship, colonial relationship with Moscow, and not just Ukrainians, but people in Central Europe, more widely speaking. And unless we do that, we will not be able to question our own imperialist view of that part of Europe. Number 4, victory. And I'm so glad that Timothy Garton already mentioned Crimea. We absolutely need to be invested in Ukrainian victory in the same way as Ukrainians are invested in it. In other words, realize that there is no choice but to see Ukraine win. If Ukraine doesn't win, we're going to live in a very frightening world. And Ukrainian victory obviously means territorial integrity. I will not repeat the things that have already been said about Crimea. Essentially, it's a pragmatic strategic choice, but it's also a moral choice. We cannot continue watching the genocide of the indigenous population of the Crimean Tatars. It started in the Russian Empire. It was pushed in 1944 by Stalin, and it continued in 2014. And every single day, I hear reports of Crimean Tatars being abducted, being imprisoned, being sent to jails, or just go missing. And we can't even locate them after. And we need to, we can't just turn a blind eye to that, or continue to turn a blind eye to that. And finally, justice. There will absolutely be no lasting peace in Ukraine and no lasting peace in Europe without justice. And it's also, I think, our duty to ensure that justice is administered appropriately in Ukraine. There are a lot of efforts to document the war crimes that are being committed by the Russian troops and to bring war criminals to justice. And we can all support Ukrainians in doing that. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for the concision, everyone's been very concise, which is plenty of time for discussion, which is great. Now, Lawrence, you've written 2 books recently, one on strategy, one on command. I booked the other panelists, but how does it look to you as a strategic point of view?
Yeah, I'll try and talk about it strategically. I mean, first, I think, presumably for everybody in this room, I've rarely sort of tried to follow an international crisis or situation where there's such a moral clarity to it. There's always a bit of a blur, but I don't feel the blur this time, and I think that's true for many people. That creates its own difficulty because we really want Ukraine to win, and for the reasons just given, it's really important that it does win. However, strategically, it's not always as simple as that. Winning against an opponent is what strategy is about, and you've got a dogged and stubborn opponent here. So we can't talk about how we get to the conclusion of this war without trying to make some sense of what's going on in Moscow. It seemed to me that the war took a very different turn in September. I think up to that point, I, like many, was increasingly optimistic, especially because of the Kharkiv offensive and the disarray that it showed in Russian forces. Putin made a number of big decisions, and it's just worth evaluating those decisions. One, mobilization. He'd resisted it, he agreed to it. And it was chaotic to start with, but eventually they got their system sorted. Secondly, he raised the stakes with the annexation of 4 additional oblasts in addition to Crimea, making it much more difficult for him to back down. And third, of course, he mounted the attacks on critical infrastructure and in Ukraine, which was probably in technically the most professional thing that the Russian military have been able to do. They had sorted out their targeting, they sorted out their methods. It's fortunately, I think, of declining impact, and it never achieved its strategic goal, which was to coerce Ukraine into concessions it was never going to make anyway. But it caused pain and caused difficulty. So you have to evaluate where we are according to these 3 factors. I concluded pretty quickly as a result of the annexations that Putin wasn't interested in a negotiated settlement. And I think we just have to accept that a negotiated settlement is not going to happen with Putin. Doesn't mean to say you can't have ceasefires, disengagement agreements, truces, all sorts of things may happen, but a negotiated settlement where he has to accept the futility of what he's tried is not going to happen, because then the reckoning is too difficult. I think there's just many people are sad about this, many people hanker after some sort of mediation, but I just don't see it. He's going to have to walk back too far for that to happen. Secondly, I think we have to note that this other, I've already indicated this other part of Russian strategy, the attempt to coerce Ukraine through attacks on infrastructure, caused pain, but hasn't worked, and we're now coming through the winter period. It hasn't worked with Europe as well, which is an important part of this. If you, the sort of painful things that we always do, sort of tuning into Russian media now and again. And a big theme of last year was how are the Germans going to explain to their population why they're freezing because of this foolish support for Ukraine. That's just gone now, because we've survived also. So it's painful for us, not quite as painful as for Ukraine, but we've survived. So then you're left with the mobilization. I think we possibly underestimated the impact of mobilization to start with, because it did allow Russia to stabilize its front lines. And I think Richard's point is extremely important. If Ukraine had had the combat power to follow up its breakthroughs in early September, we'll be talking about a very different situation, but it didn't. And Russia was able to stabilize its front lines. But what we've seen is it's not so good at offensives. And I think we just have to pause for a moment, just how little Russia has achieved militarily since it withdrew from Kyiv in the north at the end of March. We've had basically 3 grinding battles: Mariupol, Donetsk, and now Bakhmut. Other things obviously been going on as well, in which months have passed. Grim attritional battles for Ukraine as well as Russia, but that's it. And the lack of Russian offensive capacity has to be noted. And if what's going on at the moment is supposedly their offensive at the suboptimal time of the year, without bringing in, without training more of the Mobics so that they can make more of an impact than just cannon fodder. I think we just have to keep in mind that Russia has yet to demonstrate that it can generate sufficient combat power to make military breakthroughs of its own. Now, I think, so we're at this stage where that is working its way through, and it's painful, and the ammunition point that Tim and Richard have made is extremely important. Well, the UK, amongst others, sort of scouring the world trying to find old Soviet-era ammunition. It's a problem. And importantly, I think one of the things about Biden's visit to Kyiv was the announcement actually not just the tanks, but of the artillery and more ammunition to go with it. We have to encourage the movement of Ukraine to a 21st century military, just as the Russians sort of descending back into the 20th century, to 1940s with their military. So strategically, I think that the situation we're in at the moment is that we're watching this Russian stroke and quote unquote offensive work its way through. And so far, nothing has happened that gives one the sense that this is going to make enormous breakthroughs. And then we have to wait. I think it would be a mistake for Ukraine to rush into its own counteroffensive. It's going to be, I think, a very difficult period because we've just got to get into our heads that we don't want the Ukrainians to rush until they've got their units sorted out, they've got the training sorted out, they've got the systems in place. That will be difficult. But I think, just to end on a more positive note, I don't think we can assume this won't succeed. We have to keep in mind that so far the offensives that have succeeded, Russian and Ukrainian, have been against thin defenses. And so, you know, if we're talking, one of the reasons why I think Ukrainian strategy makes sense at the moment is they've got to keep on eroding Russian military strength, so that they don't have the ability to spread their combat power around. I think I've talked enough. I'll stop on that point.
Okay. Well, we now have Yulia both on WhatsApp and on the screen. Yulia, welcome. Thank you for joining us in overcoming the technical glitches. I don't know if you heard that. You've at least heard what Lawrence was saying. I think probably. How does it look to you? From you're normally based in Kyiv, but now you're in Stockholm. Is that correct? You're on mute, I think. Can you talk to us, Yulia?
Yes, I can talk to you. I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, good.
Perfect. So the courage wins, you know, and determination wins. This is the motto of our event today. Thank you. Thank you for your patience.
Well, it's your turn to talk now. If you'd like to tell us how things look to you, what your opinion is on the past year and the future.
Well, basically, it's very disadvantageous to link to the discussion at the end and not to hear a lot of speakers. So I might probably be duplicating some of the stuff. But actually, I would like to wrap my introduction around the actual question that you asked, what this war have taught all of us with regard to European security of Ukraine and the future. So the basic thing that I see that we need to consider is that we need to have all of us need to be more politically far-sighted and actually think strategically, because and in this thinking we have to consider also worst case scenarios. This was perfectly demonstrated by the actual unpreparedness of the defense stocks and defense capacities of the Western partners to support Ukraine in the scale Ukraine needs, and with the speed that Ukraine and both Western partners would like actually to help Ukraine. So this presumption. So the second lesson that is very important, as to me, it's collective synergy matters, and it wins. Definitely, it helps to win. So what we see right now, it's the result of the collective synergy, collective efforts, because this also enables us to aggregate the negotiation power and the winning synergy. So this is how we have to go ahead and to resolve the task that we discussed, obviously, over the table. It's more of immediate needs to help Ukraine win this war and win it within this year, hopefully. But then we need midterm strategies, what to do next with the security landscape in Europe, and how Ukraine fits in it, and how it could be fixed. So here I would like probably in Q&A talk about the Kyiv Security Compact and the mixed understanding of security guarantees as an interim measure, which Ukraine currently seeks to get officially fixed with the Western partners. I'll be happy to develop on that as well. And this will be a midterm interim step leading to eventual membership of Ukraine in NATO, because another lesson that we learned from this war is that no other hybrid forms of security guarantees other than security alliance, defense alliance like NATO, definitely won't guarantee any security in Europe, and neutrality is probably the least best option in this regard, because if you have an assertive big neighbor with imperialistic thinking and you are a neutral country, it always will be tempting for this imperialistic neighbor, huge neighbor, actually, to grasp something which doesn't belong to him, but actually which is seen as historically predetermined to be part of this big empire. So I'd probably stop here, and I'll be happy to join the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yulia. We've got several comments coming in online, so I'm going to, while people think of their questions in the audience, I can see 3 hands going up already, but I'd like to turn to 4, 5, 6. We'll get you all in 7. I'd like to turn to John Holmes. John Holmes has put in a comment on in the comments function, really questioning the thing about the point that several panelists made about NATO and the Crimea. So if we can unmute John Holmes, and John Holmes try and put his question to us verbally.
I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I mean, my question is about realistic expectations for the future. I mean, Lawrence is completely right that this is a very rare situation where morally right is very clearly on one side and very clearly not on the other side. And you know, I, like everybody else, I'm full of admiration for what the Ukrainians have done and are doing, and you know, hope that they can succeed. My question is whether it is realistic to expect that Ukraine can beat the Russians, throw them out of all of Ukrainian territory, you know, even bring Putin to a war crimes tribunal, which seems to me completely impossible to imagine. And somehow at that point, and Ukraine joins NATO, and then it's all fine. You know, that if you could imagine Putin falling and being replaced by a more reasonable, liberally inclined government, that might be plausible. Everything you hear about Russia tends to suggest that if Putin disappears, he'll be replaced by somebody at least as bad and possibly worse. So my question is, you know, what if we think long term and Ukraine winning, what will that look like? And is it right to encourage the expectation that that's actually possible without some potentially horrific consequences arising from that, from the fact that the Russians cannot, from their own psychology and their view of themselves and their nuclear weapons and their power, accept defeat in that way? So what will that result in?
Thank you very much, John. We are muted now.
Yes.
Okay. Now, just an organisational point. People can put in questions if they're online, either by raising their hand or by writing the chat function. It's slightly easier for me if they raise their hand, but the chat function is okay. I'm going to take 7 more questions before we come back to our panelists. And when people do write a question in the chat function, could they say if they want to speak out in person or happy to have me read it out for them? That would be helpful. Let's turn out a question in the room. Let's go to Michael Binion.
Could I just follow up on that question of China, whether in fact it is a game changer? Is it likely to change in the sense that they will be more supportive of Russia, or would it have possibly the opposite effect, that China sees this as a very destabilizing threat and will put pressure on Russia using their economic clout to actually try to damp down the war?
Okay, Martin Sandwood from the FT.
Thanks very much, everyone. I want to ask a question about public opinion and political support, which to me seem to be the precondition for any other support, financial, military, and so on. Many of you will have seen the European Council of Foreign Relations survey just a few days ago, showing very strong support for Ukraine in the publics of the Western partners. Very tepid or no support in much of the rest of the world, very much a West versus the rest picture. So it's really a sort of two-pronged question. On the Western side, how brittle do people think that support is? Many of us were worried about Ukraine fatigue in the West, and it was a very positive surprise that it hasn't materialized. But the noises are there, and in particular, some of the very prestigious figures on the traditional left, from Habermas to Seymour Hersh to Jeffrey Sachs, are sort of taking, they're not with the program, as it were. So I'd like to hear about, what should we expect? How brittle is this support? In the rest of the world, how much does it matter that it remains largely non-aligned or wants to remain non-aligned? How much does that matter, and why has it happened? Maybe the Ukrainian colleagues on the panel in particular have some sense of why Ukraine has not been as successful in its public diplomacy in the rest of the world as it has with the West.
Let's take one more shot. Arnav.
Thanks. Yeah. So following up on Martin's question about the global South, I wonder what that means if Ukraine is successful and Russia and China align. What does that mean for the structure of the world system generally and economically? And maybe a shorter term tactical question. Is there a tactical nuclear or other nuclear threat to really worry about? And if it were to happen, what do you think it would imply? Well, how would you expect the West and the United States to respond militarily and otherwise?
Okay, Hugo, squeeze in your questions.
Just following on from Michael's question, if China does get involved in supplying weapons, what is Europe and America likely to do in response? And are we looking at a massive escalation in minimum economic war and God knows what else?
Okay, that's several questions to kick us off. Let's go start with where we started before with Tim. If you'd like to have the first crack at answering some of those, Tim, then we'll come to our other.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'll take John's question, if I may, and Martin's. John actually in the chat made a good point, which is this is the first time we have a declining empire which has nuclear weapons, which if I had a bit more time is a point I would have made. John, that's why I didn't use the Gibbonian formula decline and fall of the Russian Empire, because clearly it makes the process much more complicated and actually more difficult for Russia, because the best thing for Russia would actually to be defeated as Germany was defeated. On your question, is it realistic, John? I just have to remind you that the history of Europe over the last 40 years is a history of lots of things happening that all wise policymakers said were totally unrealistic. It was totally unrealistic that the Berlin Wall could come down, totally unrealistic Poland could join the EU, totally unrealistic the Baltic states could join NATO and the EU. So I think we should be a bit careful about that. I would say NATO membership is the only realistic future for a Ukraine that is actually going to be stable and secure and prosperous. Nothing less will guarantee its security. As for the Russian reaction question, can we have a conversation about what those quote, potentially horrific consequences would be. There are better qualified people in the room to answer the question, how probable a use of a tactical nuclear weapon is. According to the FT's analysis today, Putin and his closest circle have made that analysis and come to the conclusion that it wouldn't be realistic. Very quickly on the opinion polling, which I was a co-author of the report on, 2 points, Martin. First of all, public opinion is ahead of the government's. German public opinion is now much closer to Polish public opinion than it was a year ago. So I think the only big thing to worry about would be if Trump or outright Trumpian were going to win the next US election. Now that's the one thing that I think could pull the rug. As for the global south, what we found was that India, for example, had a positive view of US, positive view of UK, positive view of the EU, and a positive view of Russia. In fact, also Turkey and China had a positive view of Russia. So they see themselves as emerging great powers who can make deals according to their own interests. And that matters, of course, hugely because India is taking a good deal of Russian oil, thus sustaining the Russian economy, and also has some weapons like China that it could potentially supply.
Thank you, Tim. Let's now turn to who's next. Richard. Yes, Richard. Yes.
Absolutely realistic to for the Ukrainians to work towards expelling the Russians from Ukraine, and I think I'm with Tim. Was it realistic to assume that Ukraine could mount a series of stunningly successful counteroffensive last year? Probably not, but my goodness me, they did it. We all underestimated. So I think there's been a change in attitude, and probably, but it all depends on the support from the West. To me, it's the more that is given now, the more capable the combined arms offensive capability is delivered, the more the logistics is delivered, more the training is delivered, the better Ukraine will be teed up to achieve success. If it's not, if we continue to dribble rather than clout, to use Guderian's term, then stalemate is the probable outcome. And it's equally realistic to assume Ukraine becomes part of NATO. Now, it's not going to happen overnight. Look what's happening with Sweden and Finland. But ultimately, there's got to be the desired set of circumstances that we should be aiming for. And the sooner we can put together a strategy or a thinking right to left with that very firmly as the I won't say end state, but the vision, then the better. China weapons, a game changer. If China gives large amounts of weapons and ammunition to Russia, I wonder, it will change it, but I really wonder how effective Russia could use them, given the challenges they're facing with manpower and firing large numbers of utterly untrained mobics scooped off the streets, given half a morning on a range with 6 magazines of AK-47, and then they're told how to tie a bandage and then put into the firing line. Well, that's not delivering a military capability. So China might give large amounts of weapons and missiles and tanks, etc., but there's a hell of a difference between giving it and Russia being able to use it effectively.
There's another question in the chat, are they interoperable, Chinese and Russian weapons?
Oh, I think you can probably assume they are. Probably a damn sight more interoperable than Challenger 2 and all the other stuff that we're giving, the Ukrainians are getting. The Noah's Ark that Ukraine have got. So yes, much more, and largely because the Chinese have stolen most of the intellectual property from the Russians in the first place. Brittleness of Western support. I think actually we've had the answers there. I think Western support has borne up remarkably well. And if we'd been sitting here when we were sitting here a year ago, I don't think we could have conceived about the resilience of Western support. More worrying, I think, is the rest of the world, and I think it does matter. I was at a thing in Hungary recently with a whole lot of people from Kenya, from Indonesia, etc., all saying this is impacting on us. It's inflation, it's food prices, it's our economic challenge, it's economic issues, and saying very firmly, loud and clear, Europe has power, but it also has responsibilities, and Europe and Western Europe particularly should sort of get over its post-colonial hang-ups and actually provide the means to provide stability, prosperity through capacity building, through other means internationally, to provide support and not least to counter the impact of China and Russia at the moment, because they seem to be making all the running. So I think it does matter. On the nuclear, I think it's really dangerous and really serious. And you might say that in military terms, you know, a tactical nuclear weapon, given the size and scale of that Ukrainian front, devastating in the immediate vicinity, but you know, you can go around it. Well, up to a point, Lord Copper, I mean, it would be a massive step. And to me, the so what's are number one, communication and keeping tabs on, well, number one, it's intelligence, understanding what the Russians are doing and keeping very close eye on any potential outload of warheads linking up with missiles, etc., command and control. But it's also about deterrence and getting the message to the Russians loud and clear that any move down this direction is going to incur massive pain. I don't think we need to say what and how, but it's going to have to. And I think I'm quite encouraged actually by the communication that Biden's visit to Kyiv demonstrated, the fact that key people in the Pentagon or Washington are talking to key people in Washington, not in Moscow. And that's a good sign. So the more communication along those lines to avoid miscalculation, the better. But it would be really dangerous.
Thank you. Olesya.
I'll only touch on two questions. So the first on realistic expectations, which I think all of us are answering. Well, let's remember that this time last year, Ukraine was given 72 hours to last. So maybe it's time for us to review our expectations and also the source of knowledge that we have. And this goes back to my point that I was making on credibility. Let's finally listen to the voices on the ground and maybe adjust our expectations as well and see that we made mistakes in the past. The second issue, question that I want to raise in response to that is that appeasement does not work. We've had years of appeasement and we've had in some ways centuries of appeasement of Moscow. We can see that it only leads to escalation. And also delays in supporting Ukraine, especially militarily, that so many people have raised on this panel, cause unnecessary loss of human life. So appeasement and delays are counterproductive. And one last thing I want to say in response to this question is that Ukraine has been perceived as a buffer zone historically and continues to be perceived as a buffer zone. So talking about consequences for the rest of Europe, we keep relegating Ukraine to this buffer zone between frightening Russia and our comfort. For as long as we're going to keep Ukraine in that buffer zone, we're going to keep it in a war zone. And that means there will not be peace in Europe. So it's in our interest to change the perception of that territory and realize that it's a country with a very clear sense of self and it's a sovereign state, and we need to help it defend itself and win. On the question of the perception in the global south, I suppose, I don't know if Ukraine lost or was losing the battle there. I know that Russia was in a battle there because of its demonization of the US, because of its demonization of the West, more generally speaking, and the democratic world and so on. It's changing. I can see delegations from Ukraine of writers, of artists and others and politicians going to various countries and talking about the situation more clearly. But also, it's not just a problem with the global south. Those messages penetrated our societies here as well. I mean, I see these kind of conversations and questions being asked of me anywhere I go, in continental Europe, in the States and elsewhere, because I think the root of the problem is that we do not, or we haven't really tried to figure out what Russia actually is, as opposed to what we would like it to be. And the key message here for us to pass to the rest of the world, whether that's the global north or the global south, is that this is a neo-colonial imperialist war. Russia is the sort of country that has very little appetite for respect of the rights of sovereign nations around it, or indeed non-Russian populations inside the country. And it's the sort of country that can use hunger and can use nuclear blackmail to achieve its results that affects the rest of the world. I think if we finally stop looking for some sort of imaginary Russia that we imagined based on 19th century literature, which we, I think, did not read in great depth either, then we will finally understand what sort of country we're dealing with. And it's going to do us all a lot of good.
Thank you. Let's Lawrence and then Yulia. Lawrence.
Thanks. So on victory, I don't think that this is sort of a Nuremberg Heath or a USS Missouri moment of signing documents of surrender. I think my view is the same kind of been that there's a gradual erosion, possibly a quick erosion in the Russian military position, and a gathering mood of crisis in Moscow, particularly amongst the military. And it's affected by a number of things, not only the situation on the ground and what they're losing. They're losing ground in Central Asia. There's a lot of chatter about Moldova at the moment. Armenia and Azerbaijan, they've got no troops left in Kaliningrad. At the start, when there were peace discussions in March, neutrality was on the table, it's taken off the table. So I think you're looking at a developing situation in Moscow where they don't see anything getting better. I think people focus far too much on the idea of stalemate and nothing changing and Russian resilience and so on. Yes, it's there. Yes, they're stoical. You just got to imagine Putin making the same speech in a year's time as he made on Tuesday, the same sort of bingo points, as if nothing. So he wasn't offering away, then we have anything more to say in a year's time. So I think that's what you're looking at. But the driver will be military action. Secondly, on the nuclear side, Russia has used nuclear weapons very successfully up to now. That's why we're not fighting side by side with Ukraine. If there wasn't nuclear deterrence, we'd be fighting. If there wasn't nuclear deterrence, he might be attacking Poland and the Balts. Nuclear weapons have already contained this conflict. And what Putin jeopardizes, should he use nukes, and Richard, I find it very hard to see. These are weapons that haven't been tested for years, on missiles that keep on going wrong, aren't desperately accurate, in areas where your own troops are fighting as well, where fallout can move in all sorts of directions. And imagine the reaction in Moscow, amongst Muscovites, if they suddenly thought the nuclear Armageddon was upon us. I've always thought this was overdone, but I'm not in a position of responsibility. So I understand why those in a position of responsibility worried about the escalation question. But it's amazing how many of the red lines that were there in the past have progressively been passed, because in the end, in situations like this, you need to win. On the NATO question, this is relevant to the NATO question. I say one word, Erdogan. We haven't talked about Turkey. But Turkey's role in all of this is peculiar and important. Now, he may not be there after the next election, and that may make a difference. But we've seen already the games he's played with Sweden. You can just imagine the games he'd play with Ukraine. But some of the Ukrainians here may help on this. My sense is the Ukrainians are after security guarantees first and foremost, of which NATO is the obvious route to get them. But there's ways of getting security guarantees without having to be a member of NATO. And I think if we look back, one of the mistakes we made was possibly not to think, because of the nuclear issue, not to think of ways in which we could actually have reinforced Ukraine, but on a bilateral basis. It doesn't have to be by making Ukraine a member of NATO. So I don't think we should get wholly bogged down on the security guarantee question. Just finally, on China, I think China is very conflicted on this war. There are big debates in Beijing. I'd be very surprised if they went all in for Russia, but they don't want to be seen to be abandoning Russia either. So I think they're pretty miserable about the whole war, other than the fact that they're making money out of it and improving their position in Central Asia. But I'd be surprised. I mean, it's not impossible if they made a big commitment with stuff to being sending stuff to Ukraine. Sorry.
Okay, Yulia, would you like to come back on some of those points?
Yes, definitely, to a lot of them, basically, because the questions revealed the general feeling that I've got from attending Munich Security Conference, that our partners actually have these doubts that, yes, on the one hand, they praise the Ukraine's courage and efficiency in withstanding Russian aggressor this year, but on the other hand, there are plenty of doubts about whether Ukraine is actually feasible to beat Russia militarily. So first of all, I would like to refer here to the report that we made at GLOBSEC with regard to the question was about how critical is support of the West to Ukraine and what to do with it or without it. So basically, we made projections with 5 security scenarios at GLOBSEC for 2023, where we determined 10 key factors, and 3 of them, the most crucial 3 of them, they bear a substantial Western assistance component. Whether it will be direct military assistance to Ukraine or the operative and tactical achievements of Ukrainian armed forces on the battlefield, which implies training with the Western partners, or its resource capability of defense and security sector of Ukraine to withstand the war, which is also very much reliant on Western macro-financial assistance now. So, but important I would like you to keep this in mind, that Ukrainians, I pretty much sure that my colleague already mentioned this in her introduction, Ukrainians are determined to fight in any case, because for us it's existential war. We understand that alternative is just to see scenes from Bucha, Mariupol, all over the Ukraine and Kyiv and other cities in the western part of Ukraine. So therefore the determination is very high. 97% of Ukrainians are not going to concede any part of the territory, regardless the cost, and we don't understand this cost. And this is actually the rhetoric that I repeat from our discussion that we had a year ago. So I said the same, that Ukrainians understand how costly this war will be, but they're still determined to fight. And actually, recent data of Munich Security Conference had a very interesting statistics. They measured that 78% of Ukrainians answered that they are ready to continue fighting, even if Russians are using tactical nuclear weapon. So you have to understand this resolution. And what does it mean for our Western partners? It means that regardless the size of your assistance, we'll be fighting. But if this assistance won't be sufficient enough for us to beat Russia in this war this year, so it's going to be protracted conflict. And in this case, we definitely will be talking a lot about this fatigue, about this difficulties to pursue European societies, why we need to spend so much money on Ukraine, or even it will be cracking more relationship with the global South, because one of the arguments they're using now that actually European partners are distracted resources and attention to Ukraine. And for these reasons, the global South are feeling themselves being underprivileged, in a sense that some of the funds that European Union had were redirected to Ukraine. So this is what about how critical support is and what we have to do with it. With regard to Ukraine's capacity to be a member of NATO, here I would like you to refer to another brilliant report, I could say, made by GLOBSEC team chaired by Nicola Unger. Recently, it was published. It is on our website. It is about lessons learned from Ukrainian war, from the war in Ukraine for NATO countries. And basically, he perfectly describes 10 main position and recommendation for NATO members where NATO countries should learn from Ukrainian experience of brilliantly handling this war. And that means that we are coming substantive to the argument that it's probably not that Ukraine should be joining NATO, but NATO should be joining Ukraine with regard to the experience that we have. So I don't want you to be very pessimistic about it. I started by saying that we need to have this determination, courage, and belief. And this is the prerequisite for victory. You know, if you don't have it, if we see this hesitation in our Western partners, we are bound to end up with all these difficulties that you mentioned about fatigue and so on. So I need also to comment about the accountability for war crimes. There was a skepticism about bringing Putin to special tribunal. Probably yes, probably you're right that physically he can't make it, because I'm pretty sure that probably he won't survive till a special tribunal. Not because it's going to take long to establish it, but because we know that there are some physical conditions of Mr. Putin that are shown clearly on his appearance and posture and so on. So I won't comment it further. But we shouldn't neglect this issue, because if you're skeptical about whether the political leadership of Russia would be responsible for the crime of aggression, and on this assumption you just simply let the issue go, then China will definitely be encouraged to follow its unilateral assertive policy, regardless the international legal norms. And this will be a huge case globally, not just about Ukraine and Russia as such. And let me finish this also about the Ukrainian capacity to win the war militarily. I had the talk with our senior generals after the sense I've got at Munich that there are a lot of skepticism and loss of belief that this might finish this year with the victory of Ukraine. And he asked me to convey this message to wherever I'll be speaking to around these days of anniversary, that it's not just about the military assistance which is coming to Ukraine, and Ukrainian armed forces are relying on it. It's also about a comprehensive strategic approach, how to beat Russia. And they understand that the fall of Russia will happen because of the a number of black swans that might start to appear in Russia. But these black swans, they are obviously difficult to calculate in advance or predict, but these black swans are not appear from nowhere. There should be certain conditions preset for them to appear. And what the Ukrainian military and intelligence forces are currently doing, they're working on these preset conditions. So therefore, please don't be surprised if at some point you will see that Russian regime will be falling very, very fast. Thank you.
Thank you, Yulia. Now about 20 people will ask questions. You can't switch you all in. A lot of people ask them online. I'm going to take some online. To speed up, I'm going to read them out. Then we'll come back to take as many in the room as we can. I'll try and fit as many people in as possible. Firstly, a question from Heather Graby, which is a very good question. Which let me try and find it where it was. Yes, here we are. What are the short-term military and medium-term security implications for Ukraine and for Europe as a whole if Russia succeeds in bringing down the government in Chisinau and a full takeover of Minsk? It's a good question from Heather in Brussels. That's one question. Coming on to from Anna Vershabenjuk, is the use of her question on nuclear weapons has been answered already, but she has another question later about something else. But to come on, Catherine Fieschi, does the panel have views on Putin's speech on Tuesday? It seemed less escalatory than everyone expected. Is this merely because he's trying to normalise the situation for his compatriots, embracing them for the possibility of the longest ever war? Rem Korteweg, former CEO researcher now based at Klingendahl in the Netherlands. What does the panel expect from the EU in terms of strategically relevant support for Ukraine? Does the panel expect or encourage fast-track membership for Ukraine, even if it hasn't reclaimed all its territory? Is the EU's decision to start common procurement of military capabilities and ammunition significant? What more should the EU do? Anna Vershman, could a fast-track NATO membership for Ukraine be traded for a quicker ceasefire and partially recaptured territories, e.g. Ukraine joins NATO but forgoes Crimea? Is that a possible scenario? And finally, I'm going to come to Pascal Lamy. I'm a bit frustrated by the answers to the rest of the world question. Does it matter? It does matter in my view, though he's not 100% sure. Pascal says, can we improve our narrative, or is the anti-West resentment too entrenched? That's questions from around the from online. Now let's come to the room. John Sawyers first.
Thank you, Charles. we're facing the prospect of a possible Chinese peace proposal. President Macron was talking, perhaps not unrealistically, that come the autumn, there might be a requirement for him to step in or others. And the risk of this is a peace process that does what 28 and 2014 did, which was to freeze Russian military gains in place and leave time for Russia to regroup and reconsider. I wonder what the panel's thoughts, and perhaps particularly Laurie's on this, of us starting our own peace process now, so that we start thinking about reasonable terms for the end of this. At the moment, we've subcontracted this entirely to Kyiv. This is not a proxy war, as you've written. This is us supporting Ukraine, and Ukraine holds the whip hand in terms of negotiations. And there's a good case for that, but I wonder if it's sufficient. And the Crimea case, for example, of course, Ukraine is going to say Crimea is part of Ukraine, but actually it's going to have to be a political process in Crimea at the end of this to determine what the people of Crimea want and what the future of Sevastopol is. Likewise, NATO membership, you can't have NATO membership unless you've got guaranteed borders. What does an Article 5 guarantee unless you've got agreed borders as to what is being transgressed? So should we be thinking about our own political process here? Obviously transparent to Kyiv, but not necessarily driven by Kyiv, that shapes what the outcome of this would be in a pro-Ukrainian mindset and not simply in militaristic terms.
Dennis McShane.
Thank you very much. I'm just writing something about the end of the West Balkans War in 1999. John was involved. It still hasn't gone away. And the International Tribunal in The Hague on war crimes in ex-Yugoslavia was set up in 1993. It didn't discourage a single atrocity. Srebrenica, Ratchat, 900 Kosovars killed, transferred to unmarked graves in Belgrade, all happened afterwards, as did other killings. So this idea, frankly, that we speed up the end of the war by frightening Putin, Shoigu, Gerasimov with sort of endless war crime tribunals in The Hague, perhaps is not that helpful. Secondly, very briefly, I spent all of the 1980s in South Africa working with Cyril Ramaphosa and black trade unions, in Brazil with Lula, organizing international support. That was my task then. Both Lula and Ramaphosa now are not with us. And I don't agree with Laurie. We may think there's an absolute moral case for this Ukraine war. They don't in the rest, too much of the rest of the world, including a large number of Commonwealth countries, Francophone countries. Ukraine, Mr. Zelensky has just passed recently a law taking away all trade union rights for 70% of Ukrainian workers. I mean, it may not matter most people in this room, but it sends out signals because international trade unions and workers groups are still quite important parts of global civil society, that this is not a war being fought like in 1940-41 with Ernie Bevan running half of the national. He was a British trade union leader at the time, became foreign secretary. And I just put it to all of us, what are we in Britain doing, or in France, or in Europe, to actually explain to the rest of the world the centre of this war? And finally, South Korea, part, I think, of our network, won't, by the finest modernizing arms industries in the world, still won't send any arms to Ukraine. What are we doing about it? Making appeals in a room like this, or even Kyiv or Westminster Hall, won't change that. Where is the Western global diplomatic initiative to make the rest of the world, or enough of the rest of the world, see this? Starting with South Africa, because as we speak, there's a giant South African, Russian, Chinese naval operation taking place just off the Durban coast. What is Ramaphosa doing with the Russian admirals at the time when democracy needs defense in
Thank you, Dennis.
Ukraine?
Dennis, you used to live in Switzerland. You didn't mention Switzerland refusing to supply any weapons to Ukraine.
Well, they supply secret bank accounts. You don't need
okay. Now, can I see hands up in here who still wants to ask a question? Okay. Only one question left. Okay. The other questions have gone away. Sir.
James Spencer, AIG. I'm struck that although the subject is lessons learned from the Ukraine war, we've actually not learned an awful lot of lessons from the last 20 years. We almost ran out of small arms ammunition in 2005. As far as I know, we've done nothing to increase the supply. We saw Iranian UAVs fired into Israel from Lebanon in 2006. We didn't seem to have done anything like that. That was in the good times. Or relatively good times. We've now got the highest tax burden since, I think, the Second World War. We've got a cost of living crisis. Are we actually going to be able to ramp up our defense spending and thus supply Ukraine? If not, what's the outcome?
Okay, thank you very much. A question online from Steve Allen. What role does the panel think the defence industry can play in moving the conflict forward? I suppose what he means is in resolving the conflict. Any other questions online or in the room? If not, okay, in that case, yes, Ian Bond from the CR. Ian.
Yeah. So
speak up so everyone can hear.
Yeah. Laurie Freedman referred to helping Ukraine. I think.
Stand up, Ian. We can't hear you.
Laurie, I think you said something about helping Ukraine to become a 21st century army as the Russians were going backward. And Richard, you referred briefly to combined arms operations and land-air. I mean, there seems to be one problem with both of those, which is the Ukrainians don't have many aircraft or many pilots. So do you think it's realistic to supply Ukraine with aircraft? And if so, who's got them?
Well, I'm going to make one very brief comment of my own on the issue of China and nuclear weapons, because we have questions about China and questions about nuclear weapons. Do the panel agree with me that it's quite significant when Chancellor Scholz went to Beijing in October and issued a statement with Xi Jinping saying that nobody should use nuclear weapons or threaten to use nuclear weapons? That was quite significant because subsequently Russian leaders stopped talking about using nuclear weapons for the whole of the rest of the year. In January, Medvedev mentioned them briefly, but no other Russian, I think, has mentioned them since then. So does that suggest does that suggest that China does have quite a lot of influence on Russia if it chooses to do so? Because when Xi said to Putin, don't talk about them, he stopped talking about them. Did the panel agree or not? That's enough for me. Let's go in reverse order this time. So we've got about 10 minutes left. So two minutes for each panelist, please. Let's start with Yulia and then go in reverse. So Yulia first, then the other panelists.
Thank you. It's not very good sound here, so I will try to answer the question that I actually recognized and fixed for myself. So basically, let me start with negotiation pattern, because I tend to see myself as an expert in this field. And for negotiations, there is no room now. There is no moment of ripeness, because both of the sides, Ukrainian and the Russian one, still believe that unilaterally they can change the status quo for their good. And unless both of the sides exhaust these unilateral alternatives, they are not going to actually sit and discuss anything. And then another element is about whether the President Zelensky might be given this mandate from Ukrainian society. I just mentioned already these figures that as 87% of Ukrainians are not going to concede the territory. So even the president, if the president raises this issue, this would create a resentment within the society, and this will make political situation internally very fragile, which will play in hands of Russia. So definitely it's not the moment to consider these options now. With regard to the partial solution, yeah, it's very linked question. So no concession on territories. There might be some smart solutions with regard to Crimea, but let me be silent on this for the time being, because we haven't explored this with all the parties so far to come up with some creative solutions into public. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. You're right on China and Scholz's meeting. I think that was important. And India said something similar too on the nuke. So yeah, I think that was important. Air power, yes, that's an important issue. Pilots of the UK is offered to train pilots, but this is going to take a while. I think we overestimate the time Ukrainians need to train. They seem to be good learners. But air power is one of these neuralgic issues, one of the red lines that eventually will be passed, but hasn't been passed yet. The plane, it's not a problem with the planes. I think it's a political decision. But they do have aircraft, and of course drones are aircraft, and drones have played incredibly important roles in this war in such a variety of ways that we didn't imagine. and the ability. I mean, the key to a lot of Ukrainian success is this combination of Starlink, the communications network, the ability to integrate intelligence from all sorts of different places, and then to use accurate artillery to attack the targets in a way that the Russians can't do, haven't been able to do. And this has made an important difference. So yeah, air power, it would be, it is not quite the combined arms we'd like, but there. Just finally on negotiations, I have some sympathy. I mean, I think it's very, I think it's possible to imagine negotiations in the future, but hard while Putin's there. But the difficulty is, as soon as we start trying to work out our own peace plan, and everybody's got a peace plan, it always has to make pretty heroic assumptions about what people will accept, where the compromises are, and so on. And it's just premature of them because we don't know. I mean, go back to the only period when there were serious negotiations, which was March into April. Zelensky had some quite interesting ideas then on the shared citizenship and Crimea, and so you can imagine those sort of things coming back. But I just fear it's premature. Zelensky also said that any agreement would have to be put to a referendum. And you can well guess what most agreements at the moment will bring. Richard Haas, who we saw the other night, has this notion of ripeness, and it's just not ripe.
I can I just say I agree with that, and I agree with Yulia. There's absolutely no prospect whatsoever of an agreement during this year, or indeed under Putin's leadership in Russia. I agree with that. I just think that the political initiatives that are coming forward are going to be basically unfriendly towards Kyiv. And then my thought was we need to think about a political process so we occupy some of this political terrain and don't leave it to those who basically want to make a Yalta type deal over the heads of the Ukrainians.
All we need to do on that is hammer home continually. Is Putin prepared to withdraw from Ukrainian territory? And unless you've got an answer to that question, then everything else becomes pretty pointless. And as he's at the moment asking for Ukrainian territory, which his forces don't even hold, I think we can guess the answer. But there's an answer to that, but I think it is in that form. And I think it's relevant to Dennis's point as well.
Right, three questions, three panelists to go. I'm going to feed in a very short question from Steve Erlinger because it's a very good question for our last three panelists. Does the panel think it's a good idea to try and drive the Black Sea fleet out of Sebastopol? They've been there since 1765. It's a Russian national security interest. What price are we all prepared to pay for that? So next, it's Olesya.
Thank you. I'll try and be very brief. On peace process that isn't necessarily driven by Kyiv, and the number of panel discussions inside academia and think tanks and so on that I've witnessed over the years that did not have a single Ukraine expert was frightening. I see few and few of those, which means that I am a very busy person at the moment because everybody wants a Ukrainian voice all of a sudden. It's good. It's good the Ukrainian voices are included. And I think if we've learned anything this year, we have to make sure that whatever peace negotiations we talk about, they have to be driven by Kyiv. They cannot be over the heads of Kyiv. Absolutely, I mean, with our support, but it absolutely has to have Kyiv as a central voice in those peace negotiations or process. What do people of Crimea want? Yeah, it's very important to ask what the people of Crimea want, but I think they can only answer it honestly when they don't have a gun held to their heads. And that's going to stop when Crimea is deoccupied. So the only way to find out what people of Crimea want is to liberate Crimea from the Russian troops, the Russian occupation. And just briefly on the question of war crimes, I would really like to invite all of you to come on Monday, the 27th of February, to an event that we've organized at the Ukrainian Institute. Is going to be held at the RSA. And the speaker there will be Alexandra Matvichuk, who is 2022 Nobel Peace Prize laureate, the director of Center for Civic Liberties, the organization that's been working to document Russian war crimes since 2014 and continues to do amazing work. Please do come and hear what she's got to say about the new tribunal and other ways of ensuring justice.
Thank you, Richard.
Impact of Russian takeover of Minsk and playing around in Moldova. I mean, well, if they could do it, it would be massive. I suspect, though, that Russia is so fixed in Ukraine that realistically, it's certainly not going to happen in Moldova. We'll wait and see what happens in Belarus, but I think it would make life very difficult. But it really plays back into the Ukrainian military objectives. But I think NATO should be thinking of its post-Soviet republic strategy, and including Moldova in that, as well as Georgia. And that really sort of goes on to John's point about I mean, I think talking of a peace is a sort of, and I take your point, but there's an element there of looking for some form of return to a status quo ante, which is not going to happen. Actually, it's a plan that ultimately guarantees security and sovereignty for Ukraine, end state NATO membership, work back from that along a series of lines of operation, putting together a strategy, part of which is the military line of operation, which sees Ukraine achieving its military objectives. And we come back to that because that is going to be the prerequisite. And frankly, just picking up that last point, one of my military objectives, if I was there, would be to sink the Black Sea Fleet. That would be absolutely hitting at Russia's center of gravity. And I'm surprised the Ukrainians haven't done it. So memo to Ukraine, have a go at it. Hang on a second, Lily, I'm on a roll. Narrative to the rest of the world. I think we've talked about that. It is really, really important. Just as a point, this year, half a million have died in the war between Eritrea, Tigray, and that war in Tigray province. 2008. Over 5 million died in the Congo and the Great Lakes region. What did Europe do about it? We shouldn't just assume that because we've got, Ukraine have got this major struggle, that Africans and others haven't had their challenges, and we have not done enough on that score. So I think we've got to think through that a bit. EU support to Ukraine, I would just highlight the imperative of reconstruction, because when the guns fall silent, as they will, Ukraine is going to need that money. Just a couple of points on sort of defense lessons of the last 20 years. I think you highlight the fact that certainly in this country, there has been in the defense world, just across the road in the Ministry of Defense, that grey Lubyanka, there has been an assumption that somehow we are exempt from warfighting, that somehow it's all about sending small groups of determined men around the rat catching or training forces around the place. Many of us old Cold War warriors have always continued to say that the first duty of the nation's defense forces is to protect the defense of the realm. And if that means killing the Queen's or the King's enemies, well, that is what they have got to be prepared to do. And that means the full suite of capability. And sort of related to that was planes. I mean, the Air Force, and I'm not a pilot by any means, but they will say, and it is right, it takes time to train a fighter pilot. It takes enormous engineering expenses and logistics support, et cetera, et cetera. But if we'd started a year ago, we'd have been a bit further down the track now. And do you remember when President Biden told the Poles that, no, you can't send your MiGs to Ukraine? I mean, when are we going to learn that it's not about incremental? It's, as I said before, fighting, not dribbling.
Okay, so Tim, you have the last word, if you can be unmuted.
I think I'm unmuted. Let me just pick 4 points. First of all, to Pascal Lamy and a bit to Dennis McShane. The first thing, if we want to reach the rest of the world or the global south, is to stop talking about the rest of the world or the global south as one undifferentiated math. I have the ECFR polling is connected to my project, Europe in a Changing World, here at Oxford. And it's quite clear, the Chinese, the Indians, the Turks, the South Africans, they don't see themselves as the rest of the world or the global south. They see themselves as great powers, the heirs to great civilizations. And so what we need is a targeted strategy for each of those countries, which, by the way, is what the European External Action Service is interestingly working on. Secondly, fast track to EU, fast track to NATO. My answer to both is no, but. No fast track to EU, because that would be very bad both for the EU and for the Ukraine. Actually, most people who are serious in Ukraine see this, but do enlargement differently from for the Western Balkans, right? So it has to be step by step. You do this, you get that. Energy, telecommunications, transport, I would say the 4 freedoms of the single market as steps along the way. NATO fast track, no, totally unrealistic. Viktor Orban and Erdogan are clearly not going to agree to it, and the country doesn't control the whole of its sovereign territory. But, and here I go very much with what Laurie said and go to what John Soares said. John, and what I think we need to be thinking about is the kind of NATO security guarantees, I mean, NATO member state security guarantees that we as Britain, along with the US and a number of other member states, might actually be prepared to offer as part of a process of thinking about the end game in Ukraine. And of course, those guarantees would apply to the territory that Ukraine actually controlled. And I think it would be important to start thinking about that now. Very final point, Charles, coming back to the long term. Long term, the alternatives of a successful, secure, stable, prosperous Ukraine, or a failed, insecure, unstable Ukraine, each of those variants have enormous implications for Europe as a whole. So it's not just the Ukrainian interest, it's very much in our interest, not just economically, not just demographically, also geopolitically. If we succeed, Ukraine will have the largest army in Europe, the most combat experienced army in Europe. Poland will have probably the second largest army in Europe. And if the Zeitenwende becomes a reality, Germany will have the best equipped. And that means we will be much better placed to contribute more to our own security. And we will have the beginning of the end of the Russian Empire, because the Russian Empire will have lost one of its most important parts. As Zbigniew Brzezinski used to say, Russia with Ukraine is still an empire. Russia without Ukraine is not.
Simon says he agrees with what you said about the global south. Thanks to everybody for joining us online and in the room here. I hope this doesn't become an annual event, this seminar. If the war goes on, it will become an annual event, but let's hope the war is over by next February. But if not, we'll meet again in a year's time. Sorry.
Let's hope it's won.
Yes, well, it's over with the Ukrainian victory, of course. Thank you very much to our panelists. That's been a wonderful.